Hello, everyone. Welcome to Common Ground Discourse. This is episode 7. I'm your co-host. My name is Shane Swor.
Godspeed. I'm Brother Kenneth.
So today we are going to be reviewing Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. And due to the complex nature of the book and the contents inside of it, we've decided to break this up into a series of episodes covering what we thought were the major topics, which just so happen to be the chapters in his book. For this episode, episode 7, we're going to be doing moral truth. And the next episode, we'll be covering good and evil. And in the third one of the series, we'll be covering belief. So 7, 8, 9 on the episodes there. So to kick this off, let's give a little bit of a background on who Sam Harris is. We've talked about him before in previous episodes. So you understand who the author is. He's got a degree in philosophy. He's also got a PhD in neuroscience, and he's the co-founder and chairman for Project Reason. And this book is, I think, I might say this too soon, but it might be his magnum opus to his entry into philosophy and neuroscience and marrying those two efforts in education that he's pursued. So that is essentially who Sam Harris is. And the reason why we chose to tackle this book, at least on my end, is because I do think that it is breaking ground and marrying something that normally isn't really an area for science to speak on. Science has had no word in morality. It's normally ever been religion or just in the realm of philosophy. So I thought it would be important to really tackle that. Why did you agree to do this project with me here?
Well, it certainly fascinated me that Harris's whole premise, and Harris being one of the more severe non-theists of the Four Horsemen, while he tries to remove religion from the landscape of morality, I find it fascinating because religion and morality have gone hand in hand for so long. Mm. And his principle is intriguing. And when I read the book, I felt that while his premise was laudable, mm-hmm. And certainly justifiable in some of the more extreme examples he gives, he presents his argument as an underhanded pitch to himself, and I feel it's worth taking on and being fairly critical of the easy passes he gave him in his soliloquy here, while still maintaining some of the good points that he's trying to bring out. I think there is a good idea behind it. I think he has played too much to his own bias in creating the argument, and I think it's worth differentiating his bias and his opportunity here.
Interesting. Yeah, and I definitely do want to comment on the easy examples that he draws out, but we'll get into that once we start discussing moral truth here. But before we really get in, I wanted to provide a summary on this book that was given by Paul Chiariello. He is a 2009 Fulbright grantee, and has an MSc in comparative education at the University of Oxford. And his summary, to me, was quite succinct, and I think it hits the nail on the head. So he goes on to say that Harris argues that science is sufficient to answer questions of who we are and what we ought to do. Through systematic observation, he argues we can discover the principles that lead to human well-being. For example, if we observe societies that veil women and commit honor killings, we would see that they produce less well-being for most of their members when compared to alternatives. Now, maybe this particular claim is false, and such societies produce more well-being, but the point Harris seeks to make is that whether it happens to be true or false is something that we can observe. The philosopher only argues that the scientists overstepping the bounds of purely empirical study in making such claims. My response to that particular summary, and to quote Harris from his book, as such, what we ought to do can never be derived from what is. At the same time, we only arrive to what is by oughts. We could never know what is without our ought for respecting evidence. What type of evidence can I provide that would convince you that you should respect evidence? I'd be hard-pressed. Because of this, we must have certain values granted to even conduct science.
Right. And in that, he's bringing a language of Hume.
Yeah.
That he's taking direct
conflict with. His ought, which he does several times, taking conflict with that. So with that summary, and again with what you've provided, I'd like to get into a few things of what this book is and what it is not, because I think that is definitely important to put forward as we continue the discussion on the system, not confuse many of the assumptions that one could make about the book, which is very easy, I think. So what this book is not, Sam does not suggest that we will hope to resolve every moral controversy through science, but he does believe that we should consider morality as an underdeveloped branch of science. Something else that this book is that science can have a lot to say about human values and principle. It is a challenge to those who believe it is impossible to think about moral truth, that those who believe we cannot converge on the same values for the greater good see that practice as a pipe dream, and that identifying that values are reducible to facts about human and animal well-being. So, with all that being said, I think we can really start getting into what moral truth is, and I know as we've discussed too, there's a lot of language that's used in this book, in terms that might have a general meaning, but the way that it's used in this context are important to define. Again, an important lesson that you teach and everyone should follow when engaging conversation is to define your terms and what you mean when you say X. So, without further ado, let's get into that. And these I think, are the most important terms that we need to remember as we continue this conversation. So one, the moral landscape. The moral landscape itself is a theoretical space whose peaks correspond to the heights of potential well-being and the valleys that represent the deepest possible suffering. Different ways of thinking and behaving, different cultural practices, ethical codes, modes of government, etc. will translate into movements across this landscape and different degrees of human flourishing. Science. What does he mean by science? Beyond just analysis and converting things into quantifiable data, science also entails a desire to understand the world, a respect for evidence, intellectual honesty, curiosity, logical consistency, parsimony, etc. And people must value this to engage in honest conversations regarding science. Belief. Our best efforts to map reality in our thoughts. When we succeed at this, we call it knowledge. It is important to note that when belief actually overlaps reality, it is accidentally true. And he talks about this. If you think about the concept of a broken clock, that a broken clock is correct twice a day, right, but then it's still failing to function as a clock. And just a quick second, what are your thoughts on that? His definition of belief in that regards, and not to launch the third episode here, but
as a taste of the third episode, yeah. I mean, obviously, as a non-theist, he's going to have a problem with belief. Mm-hmm. And he goes into great length at the end of the book as to how he defines belief.
And just to add really quick, I mean, not just being a non-theist, but one who was brought up in a secular household. He's never
experienced it. Yeah, he's never been a part of it. It's not surprising that he has a very cynical view of belief, and to think that belief is only right by mere accident when it actually is. I think it undersells, it underscores really his own disbelief in the religious experience that other people have had. And granted, as a neuroscientist, he is very particular in that way, and that's, as they say, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mm-hmm. And everything for him typically boils down to its neuroscientific roots. But to throw belief out like that, I think, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There is such a complexity of belief within culture, within the personal experience, that I don't think he gets. That I think his analogy is a bit hypocritical.
I have to draw attention really quick to the term belief and differentiating that from what he would define as faith and religion.
Right.
I think that you're absolutely right on most of those fronts when speaking about blind faith. I mean, he's definitely repeated several times that if it's right about anything, it's right by accident. And belief is really what bridges that gap between just thoughts that we have and then reality, and mapping those two over. But let's leave it at that before we start the whole new episode. Going on. when we use the term good, good is what supports well-being. When we use the term bad, bad stands for the worst possible misery for everyone. Evil would be one who would put that, or put all of us in that situation. Well-being should be equal to the concept of physical health, in that it resists precise definition and is yet indispensable. The meaning of both terms remain perpetually open to revision as we make progress in science. In terms of consciousness, this is all we can intelligibly value. So well-being, of course, it's the state that an individual is in, whether he be experiencing happiness or suffering, and that's a pin that you can put in that. But our definition of that is going to change, much like what do we define as a healthy person? That'll change over time. Right. Who we see as healthy now, living to be 75, 80, 90, 50, 100 years from now, that might be a severe illness. So it changes as we develop senses. Morality. Morality relates to the intentions and behaviors that affect the well-being of conscious creatures. And values. It's the last bit here that I think we need to define. It's a set of attitudes, choices, and behaviors that potentially affect our well-being as well as that of other conscious minds. Any of those terms you think that need any sort of revision or adding on to before we?
I don't think any of those need adding on to, but the one thing that we need to add to the list is his primary objective. Mm-hmm. That if you're looking at morality, a landscape of morality, what is good, what is bad, what is your objective, what is going to be your touchstone, your litmus test, if you will, mm-hmm. that this is a moral truth, this is a moral act. Mm-hmm. And the phrase that he uses time and time again for morality is that you are maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures. Mm-hmm. And as you define well-being, etc., we've got that, but that's really what he's trying to push for, is maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures, both individual and collective. Mm-hmm. And that's another issue we're going to have to debate later on, is how well he actually negotiates that fine line, because he does go into it. Personally, I don't think he defines it well enough when he brings up his straw man arguments, but or his low-hanging fruit, if you will. Yeah. But throughout the book, that's what we're going to push for. If we define morality according to Harris, then it is maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures. That will be our touchstone. So whatever moral act we're talking about, that needs to be our qualifier.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. And I think, that summing up our terms, we can go ahead and get into moral truth. Just saying this, I think, kind of has a charged meaning, and Harris's position, more than any else, really will see conflict with those like anthropologists, those who think that morality is completely subjective and therefore relative to certain cultures. And actually, I think it might be good to discuss this really quick, because I've been faulted several times in conversation in the past on understanding what relativism is, moral relativism, and it's been my understanding that is a position that basically says that no moral truth can be known, because it's all relevant to a culture, and a culture decides what their morality is. And so in that sense, and then we'll go ahead and get into an example here, if that were the case, then efforts like that Martin Luther King Jr. pursued was wrong, and he couldn't say that it was right, because for the most part, the culture that he was in didn't have any regards for civil rights or the equality of Black Americans. What are your thoughts on that from a relative point of view?
Typically, when I hear moral relativism, it's not so much that there can be no moral truth; it's that there is a moral truth that is dependent on culture. Mm-hmm. Is that one culture cannot look to another culture and tell them what is right or wrong. Dr. King was working within his culture, and therefore challenging his own culture and its narrative for its moral truth. So there can be a moral truth within that. Now, for one culture then to look to another culture and say what you're doing is wrong, Harris is loath to allow. Mm-hmm. He's adamantly against allowing one culture to be relative to another, and just because a culture is doing it, it somehow makes it sacrosanct and protected. And I get why he's doing that. The problem is the examples that he keeps bringing up against moral relativism or cultural relativism, which would be a tenet of anthropological study,
Sure.
is that you allow for the distinction of cultures. The examples he keeps coming up are, as he says himself, low-hanging fruit. There are clear examples of something that if you are operating at a stage 5 or 6 level of thinking in Kohlberg's moral thinking, you're starting to quote moral universal rights. And if right to life is one of those, or like, a right to protection regardless of gender, etc., then one culture is going to look to another and go, no, you cannot have female circumcision. No, you cannot kill albinos because they have magical properties for you. And I get that from one culture to another, from a moral standpoint, no, you should be able to stand up and go, no, this is wrong. You cannot do this. From a strictly anthropological study of culture, where you do not want one culture overcoming another culture, or essentially allowing globalism to wipe out cultures, then there has to be a cultural distinction. But again, Sam Harris is going for those low-hanging fruit. My problem with that is when he throws out relativism entirely, that would open the floodgate to cultural globalism, in which it just becomes one homogeneous culture, which is only going to be dictated by the strongest culture that can enforce it. And granted, he's trying to say, if they do that, it should be on scientific means of morality. So whatever they enforce winds up being the best form of morality, which I'm going to debate later, because you can't. Again, he's going for low-hanging fruit. He's going for these extreme measures. I don't think he adequately addresses the everyday aspects of morality.
Sure, and I really want to comment on this here. I think the reason why that he paints these extreme examples is because that if we can agree that this is obviously, and we can say for a fact universally, not a way that we're going to be able to maximize well-being. As a matter of fact, it's the worst possible way to get us in the valley on the moral landscape. And he makes these low-hanging fruit examples solely because it becomes easier to grant a landscape or a spectrum if you see that this is absolutely like the bad life to live and this is the good life to live. And if you can grant that, then you can admit that there are points of enhancing well-being, and therefore you can at least talk in a space where the moral landscape is something you can consider as he's putting forward. So I wonder if that's why he doesn't spend much time going into actual examples of reality, because we could debate that all day long. I think for the sake of his argument, he's just trying to find ground where we can at least permit such a theological space to exist.
I think he does it, whether consciously or subconsciously. Because what he's doing is arguing for a moral act. He's arguing time and time again with the examples he's bringing up that the action is moral or not. And if you do this, it is wrong. If you do this, it is right. The final outcome is the moral qualifier. In doing that, he removes from the table any aspect of moral thought. And this is what Kohlberg studied, this is what Gilligan studied, this is what so much of psychology and moral theorists have wrestled with, is the thought that gets you there. And he very plainly, and his cards are on the table in this, he says, I don't deal with it. This has nothing to do with what I'm trying to do. And in his book, in the first section, he outlines the 3 projects of morality. And the first one, to be true to him, I'll quote what he's got. God forbid I'll be off. But he says these are the 3 projects that we can look at. 1, we can explain why people tend to follow certain patterns of thought and behavior and in the name of, many of them demonstrably silly and harmful, but in the name of morality. Why do they do this? Because it's moral. What is their thinking that leads to this? That's Kohlberg, that's Gilligan, even Erik Erikson before. All of this goes down to the thinking that goes into it. That's the first project. The second is we can think more clearly about the nature of moral truth and determine which patterns of thought and behavior we should follow in the name of morality. That's the reflective measure, where we look at what our society is doing, or we as individuals in the society, and whether or not we should do it based on morality. Mm-hmm. What does society look like with this moral action? But again, that's what we should do. That's when it becomes the behavior, it becomes the outcome. 3, we can convince people who are committed to silly and harmful patterns, taking out the more ad hominem attacks there, but committed to silly and harmful patterns of thought and behavior in the name of, quote, morality, to break these commitments and to live better lives. So the way it breaks down is that project number 1 is moral thought. Project number 2 is more a cultural reflective measure of your moral action. Project 3 is when you begin to try to enforce that morality or convince others of their immorality so that they follow your morality. And he specifically says that, their goal, talking about project number 1, their goal is to describe and understand how people think and behave in light of morally salient emotions like anger, disgust, empathy, love, guilt, humiliation, etc. This research is fascinating, of course, but is not my focus. And while our common evolutionary origins and resultant psychological similarity to one another suggest that human well-being will admit general principles that can be scientifically understood, I consider the first project all but irrelevant to projects 2 and 3. So from the get-go, he takes moral thought and throws it out. He's focusing on moral action. The problem is that if you don't understand the action that leads to, or the thought that leads to the action, you're missing the vast majority of the psychology. And my big issue with this is that, as Kohlberg showed, as Gilligan showed, depending on your moral reasoning, you can have high-level thinking and come up with opposite decisions in some of these dilemmas. And that much of what Kohlberg deals with are dilemmas in which you have an issue and there is no right or wrong answer because both outcomes will have a negative consequence. All the low-hanging fruit that Harris brings up is not a dilemma. They are clearly someone lives or someone dies. Someone is hurt, someone is not. And it's down to, do you emotionally feel good because your religion says it, or does someone physically get hurt because your religion says it? I don't think he deals in the gray area of dilemma, and I think he purposely avoids it because at some point, by throwing out Project 1, moral thought, his whole argument starts to weaken. As our conversation went on with Sam Harris's book in his first part dealing with moral truth, we recognized that our conversation definitely went on longer than most of our episodes. So for those that would like the entire episode, you can look on YouTube and you'll see all of episode 7 as a single file. You can also go to SoundCloud and find the entire audio file for that single episode if you'd like. But for those that are looking for a more manageable episode, we will pause here at the end of episode 7A, if you will, and we'll pick up with our conversation on moral truth in episode 7B. Godspeed.